Did you know that your 3D prints may be taking longer than they need to because your infill settings aren't correct? Well, don't worry, because in this 3D Printing 101, we're going to be talking all about infill settings. Let's get into it. Hello, my name is Angus and welcome to 3D Printing 101 here on Makers Muse. So what are infill settings? Have you ever changed them in your slicer, or do you just leave them as default? Changing your infill settings to match your 3D print can save you plastic as well as time and money. But how do you know what to choose? So let's go through some great examples to see how you should choose your infill settings depending on what you're 3D printing. But first, some science. FDM 3D printers are unique among 3D printing technologies in that they build parts line by line, layer by layer from molten plastic in open air. It's this combined with the ability for these layers to overlap each other with 45 degrees or even steeper overhangs that allow FDM 3D prints to print with hollow cavities. For example, with this sphere, where only the outside is printed, leaving us with a hollow ball. Even the world's most expensive resin-based 3D printing systems aren't capable of doing this. You either end up with a ball that's solid or a ball that's full of support material that you need to drain out of an exit hole, which makes FDM 3D printing pretty unique. Because of this, it's become commonplace for 3D printers using FDM technology to print with an infill instead of printing solid. This not only saves you time because the printer's laying down less plastic layer by layer, but also saves you money because you're using less material for a given shape. But let's take a moment to explore what different infill settings actually look like and why we would use them. So here I have some cubes printing with different infill settings out of Simplify 3D. And you can see that once you get to 80%, it's almost essentially solid. You don't need to really go any higher than that. As you can see, 10% is a very low infill setting for a part this size, and an infill setting this low will result in inferior top surfaces as the part starts to fill in the top of the cube. On the other hand, as you can see, the 80% is almost essentially completely solid, and it's using a lot more plastic than you actually really need to. But depending on the part you're printing, you might be able to get away with zero infill. That's right, you can actually print parts completely hollow, and in some cases, you wouldn't even know the difference. It can take a little bit of trial and error and experience to work out which files work well with no infill. You want to avoid things with top flat surfaces that may droop down because they don't have any support. The best files that work well are ones with gradual changes towards the top of the part. You also want to avoid parts which have interior details, which, for example, this inverted pyramid in this file would not print at all if you're trying to print with no infill. It simply has no way to build that pyramid as it gets to that part of the print. There's nothing supporting it underneath. A great rule of thumb is to start at around 20% infill using the rectilinear preset, and if you're using a slicer with a G-code preview, you can preview how that infill will look on the final part. If you're using a sophisticated slicing engine like Simplify 3D, you may have access to different kinds of infill. For example, here we have 6 different kinds of infill from Simplify 3D, starting from rectilinear, which is the fastest to print, but not the best strength, ranging all the way up to a full honeycomb, which is very strong but does take longer, and even decorative infills like this wiggle, which is quite nice and looks very good if you're printing with translucent plastics like PLA. However, this is not going to be as strong as a full honeycomb infill. Thanks to its operations-based slicing approach, Simplify 3D actually allows you to set different infill settings to different areas of your 3D print, so you can get the best of both worlds. It also gives you the option to print sparse infill every second layer or more, and if you're printing at very low layer heights of 50 microns or even lower, this can greatly save on printing time. If you're interested in these more advanced infill techniques, let me know in the comments and we'll cover them in a future video. But what about at the other end of the scale? When would you want to print at a high infill, for example, at 80% or higher? Well, when I build parts for my combat robots, I need as much strength as possible, and for these 3D printed parts, I print with a high infill, as well as increasing my outside perimeters or shells. This is the amount of times the nozzle will go around the outside of the shape before it does the infill. I also recommend increasing your top and bottom solid layers to match, as this plays an important role in part strength as well. It's worth noting that increasing your perimeter's top and bottom solid layers will not affect the dimensions of your part. As you can see here, with 2 cubes are still exactly the same size, so don't worry about that. But again, it's important to note that the higher infill parts will take substantially longer than a low or no infill part, and you're going to use a lot more plastic. It's also important to note when printing in plastics like ABS that a high infill part is more susceptible to warping because you're putting down more plastic at one time, which means there's more plastic that needs to cool down, which means it can shrink a lot more than a part that's got less infill. Personally though, if you want something that's completely solid off a 3D printer, I would still print it hollow if you can, and then fill the part afterwards with a 2-part epoxy or plaster. That way you can get a part that feels very dense, but still didn't take very long to print. So thanks for watching. When combined with fast 3D printing speeds, coarse layer heights, the correct infill settings for your 3D print can greatly save you time, money, and plastic, so you can spend less time waiting for a 3D print to complete and more time creating. If you enjoyed this video here on Makers Muse, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future 3D Printing 101 videos here on Makers Muse. I'll see you in the next one. Catch you later.